Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Food Standard Agency event, Understanding Food in a Digital World. This is an event organized in partnership with the University of Sheffield as part of a festival of social science. The festival is a celebration of all social science that takes place from the 7th to the 15th of November in the UK, organized by the Economic and Social Research Council. I'm Vanna Aldin, Head of Economics and Head of Analytics and Chief Economist at the Food Standard Agency. And today I will be facilitating the event with my colleague, Michelle Patel, Head of Social Science, who will take over after lunch running the seminars. We have a really interesting packed program of speakers grouped in 5 sessions. We have a session 1 around the digitalisation of food, followed by 2 other sessions in the morning on innovative methods of data collection. After lunch break at 12:30, we will have session 4 on the potential of social media analysis, and the last final session on the public engagement with the National Food Strategy. The event will be closed by Professor Rick Montfort, Head of Science, Evidence and Research at the Food Standard Agency. Now, just a quick domestic arrangement before we start. At the end of each session, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A 10-minute session where the audience is welcome to pose questions. There will be not an opportunity for teams for this audience to pose the question apart from filling a Q&A session that you will find in your link. So can you please, may I ask you all to introduce yourself with name and affiliation before posing the question or comment during the QA session at the end of each session. Also, for logistical reasons, you will have to join at the end of the morning break, and after lunch, you have to select a different link to join back the event, which you can find in the joining instruction that you received with the program of event. Presenters, please note that this applies to you only when you wish to join the audience after you presented. Otherwise, please use the link that is being sent separately to you. The event will be recorded and proceeding of the event will be made available on our website at a later stage. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Robin May, our Chief Scientific Advisor, for some opening remark. Robin.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Vanna, and good morning. I hope you can all hear me smoothly. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Robin May. I'm Chief Scientific Advisor at the Food Standards Agency, which I joined in July. And I'm delighted to be here for the first few minutes of this. I'm sorry I can't stay all day for the conference. It looks really, really exciting, but nonetheless a pleasure to be able to say a quick hello to everybody. I think, by way of introduction, it probably needs no introduction. This is a year in which everything has come to the fore like never before. We all knew that food was pretty important a long time ago. This year has really hammered that home with, long queues outside supermarkets, empty shelves, these kind of things. It's also a year in which the importance of science and data has come to the fore like we have never seen before, and in particular the importance of social science. And I think this Festival of Science could not be better timed in terms of really reflecting on what has gone before and what might come in the future. In particular, I think what we've seen in recent years generally, and in this year in particular, is the incredible importance of digital data. We're all very digital, and this very digital conference is an example of that. And this, of course, offers us huge opportunities as individuals, but also huge opportunities in terms of what we can harvest from that for science and evidence. And I think being able to capitalize on that data, learning about people's behaviors, learning about the way that societies are shaped and the impact that food has on that is really critical. And it's impossible to emphasize more how important social science is to this. We are now, I guess, in a sort of lucky, sort of unfortunate situation that social science is in the mainstream newspapers every weekend. We all now worry about things like behavioural trends and nudge factors and these kind of things, both in a positive and negative context. And I think one of the key things I'm hoping will come out of today is how we can harness those kind of research trends to really understand better food in this digital world we're in, and to know how best we can shape both the science and policy going forwards to make sure that we do our very best to keep the food on our plates, the food safe, and to in the best possible way give consumers the maximum choice of what they eat and when they eat it. So thank you very much for joining us today. It's a great pleasure. I have to dash off to another conference in our digital parallel world very shortly, but I will hang around for a few minutes. And now I will hand back to Vanna. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robin. And now a few opening remarks by Julie Pearce, our Director of Openness, Data, Digital and Wales. Julie?
Hello everyone, and thank you very much, Vanna. Indeed, welcome to Understanding Food in a Digital World. And for me, I'd like to emphasise not only the word digital, but also data. So yes, I'm Director of Openness, Data, Digital Science and Wales at the FSA, and I think corralling all things data, digital and science into one team reflects how increasingly intertwined they are. So there's more and more data out there, and also there are more and more tools to process and make sense of all of that data. That data in itself is becoming more and more personalised and in real time. But also we need the social scientists to very much help us understand people's attitudes to that data, attitudes to those insights, and also all of the ethics around all of that. So I think social science is becoming, as Robin said, increasingly important to us all as we embark on this journey. And that journey has been so accelerated in the last few months through COVID-19. We've seen many of the changes that were already starting to happen, but to those be really accelerated, whether they relate to people's behaviour, attitudes to food, what's important to them, but also those digital business models as to how companies have been forced to change how they operate. And one observation for me is the speed of response. So I operate in this world of data and digital all the time, but and I'm very familiar with what can be done, but the speed of response for all different types of companies has been just amazing. And I think the general view is much of what we've seen cannot be put back in the box. Exactly what will be taken forward and survive, maybe we don't quite know, but certainly much of it will stay and become just how we work and how we operate. But the next question then is, so what next? So after all of that change and all of the other ongoing changes that we can see coming over the horizon, particularly for the food sector, what is it that we're going to see next in the way of using those digital tools? Whether again being how we operate as businesses, whether we're using AI, using robotics in how we deliver the manufacturing and production of the food, or whether we carry on into a world of digital twins. So all of that technology, all of that data, but very much people trying to make it real and people trying to make sense of it all. So please do have a great day. The agenda looks just fascinating. I think we'll cover a lot. Please engage with it and do ask your questions. And thank you very much. So I'll hand back to Vanna.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks, Robin, for all of your comments. So we're ready for session 1 on the digitalisation of food. For this session, we have a free presentation. The first one will be by Michelle Patel, Head of Social Science, and she will be talking to us about the impact of COVID-19 on consumers and the food system in the UK.
Am I live?
Michelle?
Hello, can you hear me? Hi there, good morning, and thank you, Vanna. And thank you everybody for having the time to join us today. My name is Michelle Patel. I'm the Head of Social Science at the Food Standards Agency. And Kabir, if we could switch to my slides now, that would be great.
Yes, your slides are on, Michelle.
Thank you. So I'm just going to set the scene really by looking at the impact of coronavirus on consumers of food. You just heard Julie mention some of the ways that has changed how we eat, where we get our food from, but it also has changed how we've measured it. So today is going to be, I think, a fascinating trot through some very short presentations to look at what we've been doing recently and how that has been affected. It's our job in the Food Standards Agency to regulate the food system, guided by the interests of consumers. And so it's important that we keep up to date and really try very hard to understand what those interests are, that we try to be more inclusive in the way that we understand the term consumers and anticipate what those needs might be in the future and how the food system may be changing so that we can anticipate it with the right regulatory environment. And in my team in social science, we use a range of tools across all types of analytics and data science and economic, market and social research, as well as expert support from the academia and our committees and our expert panel. And we draw on intelligence from the food industry and other government departments. And of course, as well, we conduct our own primary research, which includes all types of qualitative research, surveys, quantitative analysis, experiments, and some of the more innovative ways of collecting data, including things like social media listening. Early into this pandemic, we were asked to monitor the food landscape really closely to help us understand and, if possible, anticipate what would be needed from the FSA. So I'd just like to start by setting the scene, because obviously we've been looking at this for the best part of 2 decades. That we didn't just start understanding consumers in March 2020. So our latest data tells you quite a lot about how people cook and eat food in this country. So, and by in this country, I mean England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Those are the countries we cover. So before COVID, women were twice as likely to do the food shopping and the cooking. The wealthiest 10% spend 4 times more on food than the lowest income decile. But the average UK household spends just over £3,000 on groceries and just over £1,500 on restaurants and takeaways every year. And most people shop for food in large supermarkets. Most people eat twice as much sugar and more saturated fat than they should. Most people say they eat 4 or more portions of fruit and veg a day. Teenagers eat less. And about a quarter of people say they pay attention to nutritional information when shopping. 10% of people say they never think about it at all. In fact, 10% of people tell us that they rarely or never eat anything they would consider healthy. Most people, however, do enjoy food. They enjoy cooking and preparing food, and most people say they have time to do it, although only 1 in 20 of us is willing to spend more than an hour cooking a meal on the weeknight. Women are, again, more likely to be responsible, twice as likely, in fact, to be responsible for all or most of the cooking in the home compared to men, and 71% of women cook at least once a day. We measure what consumers say they're worried about. And I can tell you that over the past 10 years, these things have sort of jostled for first position, but these are pretty constant things. So food waste, the amount of sugar in food, animal welfare and food prices are often in the top 5 of things that people are saying, but they move around, and you'll be able to look in our public attitudes tracker, which we've been publishing for 10 years, to see how that's happened. Another thing that we've noticed is that over time consumption of red meat and cooked meats has gradually fallen. Now it still accounts for about 10% of the average household budget a year, but that has fallen a lot. In 2012, 75% of adults ate red meat at least once a week, and now that is 55%. How is the world changing? What's different? And what have we seen be different since March this year? Well, we've seen that the way people shop has changed. So consumers shop less frequently, but they spend more per trip. And that's not surprising when obviously it was a real, much more of a reflective act to be popping into a shop. Again, unsurprising, online ordering and delivery has increased by 75% and remains up 76% compared to 2019. Local shopping also increased. So 29% of people said they used their local corner shop or convenience store for the first time, and 34% of people buy from a regular local supplier like a farm shop or a veg box, and we also saw frozen food sales double. None of this is surprising given the situation. What we're interested in is how many of these behaviours will stick. We've also seen that 44% of people say they're trying to eat more healthily. However, actually what we've seen is that people are eating less healthy food. The saturated fats have increased by a little bit, while sodium has also increased by a little bit in the average shopping basket. And there is a good chunk of people, about 18% of people, say that they're eating more comfort food and takeaways than normal, and 40% of people say they are eating more unhealthy snacks. And this is a trend we've been monitoring over the summer. Another trend that we have been monitoring over the summer is that the increase in food insecurity. Now, I'm sure that you will have all have seen the headlines, and you will have seen, I hope that we've been publishing research on this, but over the summer we have seen, sadly, a marked increase in food insecurity, which we've been measuring in a couple of ways. We know that use of food banks and use of local authority and community schemes has increased. In fact, 1 in 4 people under 25 used a food bank or charity over the summer, and about 24% of people worry about being able to afford food, 18% saying that they have skipped meals because they couldn't afford food in the month prior to the question asked. To set against this, the cost of food has increased, and the latest figures indicate a 3% increase in the cost of food. So this is something we're looking at really closely, and our figures have informed the National Food Strategy and their interim report on the impact of COVID published earlier this summer. For those of us who are employed and working from home, that's also had an impact in how we eat. So a third of us say that our lunches are worse now than when they were in the office. However, there's also a knock-on effect of being home. About half of people are enjoying cooking more. 4/5 of us ate with family in the last month, and pre-pandemic people said that hardly ever happened. And well over half say they value food more than pre-pandemic, and have really been more reflective about things like food waste. In fact, our data indicates, or RAPS data actually indicates, a 30% reduction in household food waste measured by what is actually observed. And a trend that we've been monitoring for some time is the increase in interest in plant-based food or meat reduction, or however you want to frame it, particularly among younger people. And there's some work we published last year around the food aspirations of Generation Z, which would indicate this is the case. And people have said that the pandemic has actually accelerated their reflection on eating less meat. This is a day about talking about online and digital food. So let's look a little bit more closely. We saw little net change during April and May, and then an increase during June and July. Now, I would conjecture this is as online supermarkets brought more of their delivery services to bear, and they got more capacity. That capacity was filled, and I think we will probably see that again as we go into a second bout of lockdown. And 24% of people in June and 26% of people in July said they were doing it more often than compared to before lockdown. Of course, that was a lot higher among those who were shielding, which you can see why that might be. But what I also think is really interesting is the way that local suppliers have responded, and those who have been able to set up a website and get their delivery options seem to have really benefited from this. We've seen again a huge amount of people buying local food, and farm shops and vegetable boxes and those sorts of services seem to have had a surge, which I would be very interested to see whether that tails off or whether that's something that's going to stay. We're seeing this more among younger respondents and obviously among those who can afford it. But also, again, we've seen about a quarter of the people who were shielding were also more likely to report purchasing food from local suppliers compared to the general public. And it's worth zooming out because we also did a lot of qualitative research with consumers over the summer, and to really look at how this has changed how people engage with the food system more generally. And we found that there was as ever, a huge amount of cognitive dissonance in terms of how people engage with food, but people were particularly finding it uncomfortable to think of food or the way that they eat as potentially unsafe. And we saw some really interesting ways that people were re-evaluating their risk perceptions and using their own rules of thumb and heuristics to work out what was and what wasn't safe to do. So we saw the influence of social proof. People really were looking to those around them to decide what was normal and safe within their own communities and within their families. And of course, your general attitude to risk, unsurprisingly, tended to inform your risk behaviours. So people who felt most at risk more generally were more likely to display more changes in household food behaviour. We also found that whether people were employed and were earning was a factor. People who have jobs that require daily exposure to the outside world were likely to also be more open to more risk in their food. Some were less comfortable with this, but they felt they didn't have the luxury of being too risk sensitive if they were taking those risks out in the world. And early on, we saw that fears of foodborne virus transmission were pretty widespread. Many people were decontaminating food or food packaging in the early weeks of lockdown, and that we saw tail off. Obviously, our risk assessment indicates that the likelihood of foodborne transmission is very low. And we saw sort of a game of two halves. Some people found themselves very pressured during the pandemic and went on to only really think about it in terms of a negative disruption to their household food habits. Others found that it provided a break from the routine and it allowed them to think more and enjoy more food and to eat with others more and become more connected with food. So we really we really saw a very different response depending on what else was going on in people's lives. Likewise, on health, some people have become much more health conscious. However, many others had responded to increased stress and other pressures by snacking and quick foods and other ultra processed foods, or indeed drinking more alcohol. We ask a lot about trust in the food business because obviously food industry is what we regulate, and in fact what we found was that it had mostly strengthened during the pandemic, and we believe that might be driven by that robust return to normal after the early disruption and the empty shelves. And the effect was stronger for supermarkets than it was for local suppliers, and some people had noticed that local suppliers had to increase their prices. Now, when we talk to people about food systems, we often have to go through quite a deliberative process because, you know, although food is something that we all interact with pretty much every day, it is a complex and systemic risk that people are taking, and one that people take routinely. So it's not something people think about front of mind an awful lot. And so we often have to go through quite a lot of groundwork to get people to conceive of food as being part of indeed a global system. What we found was, because of the salience of food during the pandemic, is that awareness of food system issues have been more prominent than in past research. So, for example, those supermarket shortages called to attention the way that supply chains were managed. Although they were interpreted as driven by panic buying, actually people then stepped back and thought about things like just-in-time supply chains, the amount of touch points and how many people were involved in local supply chains, and indeed the role of people who provide food as frontline workers necessary to the good functioning of society. And a few participants had reported some more profound shifts in their thinking about food systems, particularly tied to things like social justice. One participant in our qualitative work had really started to talk about who held the power in global supply chains, and had formed some really strong views around the need for more local food systems. Now, we're still tracking this, so this is a shameless plug. We've published our work, we'll be keeping on publishing what we're tracking, and the next batch, I guess, will look at the situation after July, and we're going to be releasing that before Christmas. So the reason we're tracking food at home is particularly around a couple of areas. In terms of food hygiene, which is, you know, one of our core areas, we're very interested to see if increased hand hygiene is reducing foodborne disease. But we're also interested to see if people are cutting corners with food hygiene, either because they're not used to cooking or because they're trying to stretch food further because they're worried about being able to afford it. As I said, we are monitoring and publishing on food bank use and other measures of household food insecurity. They have been feeding into the National Food Strategy and also into the way that PHE were measuring their non-disease related COVID measures, and we will be continuing to track and publish throughout to the spring. Longer term, we want to be looking at the impact of economic insecurity. I think we all know that there is an economic downturn on the cards, and we really want to see what impact that might have and anticipate the impact that it might have on things like food crime, food business behaviours and consumer behaviours, as I mentioned before. So over the course of today, you'll be hearing more about some of the ways that we and others are doing it. I hope we have a useful and interesting day. I want to take this opportunity to thank the analytics team at the Food Standards Agency and all the other presenters from the academic community that we've been working with, and our international colleagues, of course, which I'm looking forward to hearing from today. And I'll stop there and hand back to Vanna. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michelle. This was very good session. I think there is an echo. Can you hear me, Kabi?
Van, I can hear you, but I'm getting an echo.
Michelle, can you go mute, please?
Oh, you're better now.
Yeah, that stopped. Okay. There are already some questions for Michelle. Thanks to everyone. Keep posing questions. We will look at them after the other two presentations. I'd like now to introduce Lucy Hart from Foundry 4, which has been doing for FSA a quite interesting piece of work on better understanding the online platform and their impact on the food landscape. Lucy.
Thank you, Vanna. Yep, that's exactly what I'm doing. So I'm Lucy Hart from Foundry 4. I'm just going to share my screen with you now to get my slides up. Excellent. So exactly as Vanna said, I've been working with the FSA team under the Achieving Business Compliance programme from summer this year, with a particular focus on online food platforms and how they're changing the landscape of food. I've mostly been carrying out secondary research, but I've also undertaken interviews with online food platforms. So some of the views that you'll see here are influenced by that. So today I'm going to run through these 4 questions, which is mostly what I've been working on. So the first is back to basics. What is an online food platform? How might we define those? The second, what kind of platform exists in the current market and what might arrive in the near future? The third being how big the market is and what we can expect to change. And the fourth, thinking about what does that mean for the wider food landscape beyond the digital platforms themselves. So the first question, what is an online food platform? Starting in the past, there were normally 2 main routes to get food from vendors to consumers. And here and in the following slides, I use the term vendor to talk about any individual or business that's selling food. So that could be a restaurant, a cafe, a shop, but also a farm, a factory, a mobile caterer, etc. So in the past, it was these 2 main routes. It was from vendor directly to consumer, or vendors selling to retailers who then sold on to consumers. But in the 1990s, a new way to sell to consumers emerged, and that was via a platform or an intermediary. And the transaction here is different. So where vendors sell directly to consumers or sell to retailers who sell on to consumers, a platform facilitates or brokers that deal. They never actually own the stock. So when we're separating out the 3, vendor, retailer and platform, this is one of the basic differences we can look at. At the moment, most platforms don't own the stock, and there is some of that changing, but there's a kind of general rule for now. And it also has an aggregation element. So it sells the stock from more than one vendor and provides multiple vendors to choose from for the consumer. So how do platforms describe themselves? Well, many of them, and particularly the larger ones, don't really define themselves in relation to food. They talk about community and about connection. And that really matters because it means that their priority is being customer centric, making that exchange of food or other goods or services really easy for both groups taking part in the transaction. And on the other side, they've got the technology focus, and that really matters because they're often online first. They're what we call digitally native, i.e. they never had a physical presence, and they have very strong data and digital capabilities. It also means they're much more agile as businesses. They change their model much more easily. And if you bring both these points together, so the technology point and the connection point, it means that platforms tend to have the most data and information available on what's going on in some of these food chains. So why are they used so frequently and increasingly frequently by vendors and consumers? Well, another key attribute of the platforms is what's called the network effect. And in the case of food platforms, it's often an indirect network effect. And what that means is that vendors on one side of the platform benefit from having more consumers to buy their goods. And consumers on the other side of the platform benefit from having more vendors to have more choice. Eventually, what this means is it becomes quite hard for vendors not to use the platform because that's where you access most of the consumers. And it translates to that platform having a certain level of control or influence over the landscape. So to sum up, this is how I'm defining an online platform. It's something that's a customer-centric technology business over and above its involvement in the food industry. And that's important because you've got technology businesses coming from elsewhere into the food landscape. It facilitates the exchange of goods, and in this case food, between vendors and consumers, and doesn't own that stock. Most of our platforms make money by charging a commission on each transaction that takes place. The way they do that differs, and some will charge more if a vendor is using multiple platforms. So what kind of platforms exist in the landscape? Well, there's many factors to consider when we segment this market, but some that I'm going to highlight are the goods and services being exchanged, the timescale at which those goods or services are delivered. So is it on demand, is it immediate, or is it something that's scheduled for next Monday? What route is that food taking from the vendor to consumer? And what's the nature of that transaction? Does it tend to be standardized and formal, or is it something that might change according to the kind of direct messaging and something more informal? A combination of these factors brings us to these three broad categories, and Jose, who's talking after me, will talk in more detail about how we might divide up this market, so I'll leave him to elaborate on that. But the ones I'm going to talk about today are on-demand food delivery platforms, scheduled food delivery platforms, and marketplaces. So this first group, on-demand delivery platforms, most of us are quite familiar with this model. So it's getting a hot takeaway meal from the vendor to the consumer, and that happens where the vendor is cooking it in their own kitchen, so in a restaurant kitchen or a cafe kitchen. That exchange is taking place in a platform where the money is also transferred, and that food's being delivered by courier, by delivery driver, or potentially it might be picked up in person. And you're likely also to be familiar with the big three players in this market in the UK, which are Uber Eats, Deliveroo, and Just Eat. Although I should note that Just Eat has about 10 times the market size of the other two. However, along with restaurants being delivered through these services, on-demand platforms also facilitate the sale of food from virtual restaurants, home cooks, and increasingly from retailers. For example, you can now order from Cost Cutter via Uber Eats, or you can order from Shell service stations, Waitrose, and the Co-op via Deliveroo. Home cook platforms are a little earlier and tend to be more localized. That's where you've got people cooking in their residential setting and delivering those food to people in the local area, and that can be on demand. It can also be scheduled as well, but these platforms are fairly early in their journey. So what's a virtual restaurant or brand? Well, where a restaurant creates food in its own kitchen, a virtual one creates food in another space. This is frequently in what's known as a dark kitchen, but can also be in another brand's restaurant. So, for example, a restaurant that's underutilizing its kitchen might say, actually, you can use that space to cook for another brand another time of day. Sales are only taking place via a platform, and there are no direct sales to consumers, no eat-in options. So that food is specifically made for delivery. It completely cuts out the front cost of the front of house, so you can see why there's a real appeal there for a lot of businesses. And virtual brands can be created by incubators like Taster and Deliveroo Editions. They look for market demand and create a relevant brand based on demographics. So they look at the area in which they are hoping to launch a brand. They think about the age of those consumers, the economic bracket they're in, etc., and think about what kind of brand might be most popular. And they can also be created by bricks and mortar restaurants. So, for example, Cheese Louise, you can see here, was created by Byron, which is a British burger chain, and which has a physical presence. So although you can see the address is Byron, there's no branding shared between the two brands. The second group was scheduled food delivery platforms. And these tend to aggregate deliveries from multiple suppliers. They do so with their own delivery in more cases, whereas on-demand platforms use delivery partners. And food-specific platforms here usually focus on organic, ethically made produce, while the generalist ones tend to be more gift-focused and often delivered by post. So that might be things like brownies in the post or jars of chutney, etc. And then marketplaces, which are slightly more wild west of the food platform business, have kind of three subsets. So you've got a more structured exchange on the large platforms, which are all generalists, so they sell other goods that aren't just food. Then you've got social media platforms, which are increasing in popularity as a means to sell food. And these differ because the financial transaction often takes place offline. And much of the exchange is kind of hidden in direct messaging. So there's much less visibility there about what's going on in terms of food sales. And even here, the examples you can see of items listed for £1 is normally because they are going to agree the price later on. And then thirdly, we have food redistribution platforms, which take surplus food from retailers and individuals, and they make it available for individuals or charitable causes. appreciate this is a whistle-stop tour, sorry, but I will be happy to answer questions afterwards. So how big is this market? Well, it's big and it's growing. There's been a huge uptick in the proportion of e-commerce online during the pandemic, as you'll have seen in Michelle's presentation. And a good way for us to track which type of market is gaining traction is to look at the funding achieved. So we've seen a lot of funding for dark kitchens recently. And an example, K-Box received 5 million in seed funding recently, which was for this new concept in which, rather than renting kitchen space, K-Box essentially rents out brands. It looks for underutilized catering space in pubs, hotels, or leisure centres and identifies a virtual brand that would work well in that location. It then tests out that brand and licenses it to those kitchens. So basically they might provide the kitchen with either a kind of half-made product, which is then finished off in the kitchen, or they might provide the kitchen with a recipe, branding, etc. for delivery only food. So this is just a taste of the expansion of models within the platform space. So what does this mean for the food landscape more generally? Well, there's a lot of changes. And it would be interesting to kind of see which of those have affected the stats that Michelle was just sharing. So we've got tech businesses entering the food world. These are people whose expertise is in data and digital rather than coming from a food background necessarily. And they've had the ability to rearrange the supply chain. So they're able to take steps in different orders and different methods than historically was done. The third point here is that there's lots of businesses which are online as default, i.e. they don't have an obvious physical presence either to the consumer or to the authorities that might want to regulate them. It can be quite hard to locate and identify online sellers, especially when they are individuals selling through the marketplaces. The fourth point is that there's a lot of information on the supply chain. So some of these platforms have huge and detailed amounts of data. For example, on the length of time a delivery driver might wait at a restaurant to collect food before they take it on to the consumer, or on the number of allergy-specific requests made in orders. And kind of linked to that, we have the increased interconnectedness. So we've got these businesses which formerly were working quite independently to one another who are now connected in some way through a platform. And that platform is also able to provide kind of amplified messages to all those businesses through their email communications, etc. Number 6 is that these business models are ever adapting. So it's really important to be aware that these business models are changing on monthly basis, if not more, because, for example, Amazon launched a restaurant delivery service in 2016 called Amazon Restaurants that ran for 2 years before closing. It's now taking a big investment stake in another delivery platform. So you can see how quickly these businesses are changing with the landscape. And number 7, the bundling and unbundling of steps. So what I mean by this is that a delivery platform or an online platform might just take one step of the chain. So they might just do delivery, or they might just do aggregation, or they might bundle up a whole set of steps together. So for example, Deliveroo has its own dark kitchens and takes so much kind of has expanded upwards through that supply chain. The ability to set up a restaurant and get operating online is much easier now. The barriers to entry have fallen right down with the online platforms, and that means that businesses can pop up much more quickly and can change their model much more quickly. We've seen a lot of that during the pandemic in terms of businesses starting up to put direct-to-consumer meal kits, for example. And there's much lower visibility of business identity. So I mentioned this before, in terms of being online, but I think that as a consumer looking up the supply chain, it can be much more difficult to understand who it is that is selling you that food, who it's being provided by, and where it's coming from. And the final point I've got here is that there's private standard setting. So where a platform invites vendors to operate via the platform, it's able to set its own set of standards, and that might be saying that there has to be a minimum FHRS rating, food hygiene rating scheme, of 3, or it might be that they have to have a certain type of insurance or a certain quality of product. There's a whole nother set of standards going on alongside the main regulation. So I think that takes me up to the end of my 10-minute time slot. So thank you so much for listening. I've worked on a full guide to online platforms, which I can share. So please do ask for that. I'm lucy.hart@foundry4.com, and I look forward to the questions later on as part of the panel. Vanna, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Yes, apologies. Thanks, Lucy. We are now going to the third and last presentation from Dr. Jose Bolanos, who is a postdoctoral research officer at the Food Standard Agency, sponsor from the London School of Economics, and he will be presenting food in the platform economy, leapfrogging risk regulation in the context of a platform economy. Over to you, Jose. Jose, please note you have only 10 minutes.
Yeah, I tend to go over time, so that's why Vanna is warning me about that. Hi, everybody. Just saying hi before I share the slides, so you can see my face. There we go. Now that should be on your screen, right? I think. Thank you very much for being here. Before I start, I want to show you something that arrived at my door just yesterday, and it's that letter. A neighbor who ran out of job and is now going into the business of selling food online. They don't have a platform yet. They're doing it through Instagram and email. But they have down there on the right, you can see they have an allergens declaration. And I thought that was amazing because this paper is written by hand because they didn't have the money to actually make like print out things, but they introduced the allergen declaration in the paper by hand. I thought that was like amazing because it tells you two things. One being that you need to trust in people. Here's some people that are struggling, but they are finding a way to get out of this struggle. And then the second thing is that you need to understand that people in the platform economy will innovate, because that is the one constant of the platform economy. It allows you to do a lot more than you could do otherwise, so you will find a way to innovate. Therefore, innovation is really the only constant that you can find in it. Right, so now let's go at what I did for the FSA. Essentially, the problem is that we don't have a systematic way to assess the food safety and integrity risks posed by online food businesses. And this was already a salient problem, a salient need, but COVID highlighted it even more. Now, the opportunity, however, is that while there is no specific risk assessment for the platform economy, the FSA does have first-class risk assessment resources, and those apply to all food businesses. And also, it had undertaken research about food in the platform economy that gave a launching pad for an effort to put together those pieces and join it into something that could be a little step or a leapfrog, couple steps into the direction of risk assessment for food in the platform economy. Do note, however, that because there is already a base that applies to food businesses, this is about the additional risks that may come along with digital operations. And then the foundation, there's a full background of theory here, but essentially the platform economy is complex, which means there is complication, there is reflexivity, which is things that mutually influence each other, and there is a lot of uncertainty. So we're aiming for a modular design that many different modules can contribute to other things, even if the big thing acts separately. I just like to put it in a humble way. Let's just say I get wrong the big thing. The small little parts should still be helpful in a way. And then the second is we are aiming for, well, I was aiming for risk assessment that helps both the FSA and businesses. Because when you have a very complex situation, you cannot pretend that you will be able to be able to solve everything. You need the help of every bit of the system. So it's a tool that helps both, and then it creates a hopefully mutually beneficial cycle. And then the deliverable, because it's in little modules, I call it an IKEA-like risk ranking metrics, except of course, mine is a lot easier to put together risk. I've tried those things and like they really take off lesson. That said, it is a TRL3 product. That is a proof of concept that shows functionality and feasibility and enables larger scale prototyping as opposed to a fully developed product. It's still 3 steps in the TRL process, which is like worldwide famous. If you want to ask a question about it, I'll be happy to answer it. But there are 9 steps in total, so they're still a way ahead. And it's made of 3 modules. One is a typology, the other one is a list of hazards, and the third one is a risk maps that like add into a risk ranking matrix. I'll go over the modules very fast, but mostly what I want to show in this presentation is the full functionality. But it's important to know that the typology and the list of hazards, these are all the result of engagement with different people. So for example, the typology, in the process of building that typology is where I learned a lot from Lucy, who was just speaking, and also from Beatrix, who will be speaking later. So it is a process that includes a lot more parts, but since we only have 10 minutes, I'll just go straight into the full tool. I'll flash you a little bit the typology, and then the list of hazards. It has a question for self-assessment and one for diagnosis, so that it's both useful for the FSA and for businesses. And then risk maps is how to categorize the likelihood, impact, and uncertainty of different answers. So now I will have to change the document that I'm sharing, because to show you the big document. And don't worry about it, we're still in time. Right, so now you should be seeing an Excel document in your screen, correct? This is the file of the risk ranking. It is divided into the different modules. The typology is the first one. Here is what allows to separate different types of businesses doing activities online or online food businesses into categories, and you'll see that the platforms would fall into intermediary and informative. And within each of these categories, you can divide them into platforms that deliver immediately, platforms that schedule delivery, or platforms that have minimal interaction between users, or platforms that have maximal interaction. So it is a very scalable typology. And then the hazards, they are divided as per type of business. So each of these lists is applicable to a different type of business. It has estimated impacts, but let's remember that this is a proof of functionality. These impacts are only for the functionality of the file. So essentially, what this does is it separates the hazards applicable to all businesses, only to vendors that also engage in logistics, to vendors that are artisanal in size, and then a bunch of other separations. The same happens with the hazards for intermediaries. It is made of small sub-modules. Now, the risk rules basically define how you're gonna assess the likelihoods, impacts, and uncertainties. And then at the end, you get into a big form that joins everything. I'm gonna start by the self-assessment of vendors. When you get there, it's gonna have something from a previous analysis. So I'm gonna make it bigger. You click here to reset it, and that cleans the form. And then with the buttons provided, you select the type of business that you're analyzing, because as per the list of hazards, there are different hazards that are applicable to different businesses. So you don't want to get hazards that are not applicable to yours. So I'm just gonna select one business that does not do delivery, and it will apply the questions for that particular type of business only. And then I'm going to say, well, this is a small business, an artisanal business. It will add questions that are only applicable for artisanal businesses. And because I want a pretty form, I'll click formatting at the end, and it will give me a formatting. Now, remember, this is the self-assessment. So as a business, I'm going to be, okay, well, do I have an FMS, a food safety management system in place? Actually, yes, absolutely, I have it. So it will tell me it's the lowest. But then in a different question, I'm going to be like, actually, I don't do that. So it will tell me it's the high risk position. The goal being that, well, I want to turn reds into greens. And then the assessment works in the same way, except that it's a single form. I choose the type of business that I am analyzing or inspecting, depending on who you are. I choose whether it's a business level or a type level assessment. So am I analyzing a business or a full class of businesses in the platform? And then I give it a format. The form itself will bring the estimates for impact that are entered in the list of hazards. Let's remember these are only for functionality, but once they are defined, they'll be there already. And then the inspector can answer equally. Here it will give it a score, and all scores will be added on top on this total risk score. As risk rankings work, the idea is analyzing a bunch of businesses, 3, 4, 4,000, and then comparing them as per the last score that they have. And yeah, that was it. Thank you very much. And I'll be flipping back to the presentation. Actually, I won't flip back to a presentation, but I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose. I think if you can go on mute, please. Okay.
Vanna, you're on mute.
No, okay. Apologies. Yes, I was on mute. Thanks, Jose. We can now have a few minutes for addressing some of the questions that we can see on the panel. Shall we start with a question for Michelle? Before COVID, Michelle, decrease in meat consumption. Is this due to health concern or affordability of red meat or both?
Thank you for that question. Am I live?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I think that there's a combination of factors driving this behaviour. I think that what we've heard people talk to us about are the health concerns around red meat, but also increasingly, and particularly around younger people, we're seeing an increasing concern about the sustainability of particularly red meat, and people are seeing that the impact on climate change of farming red meat is significantly higher, particularly around beef, than it is around other sources of protein. So we do have people spontaneously mentioning that to us, and I think it's worth saying that while we see a large increase in the amount of people talking about meat reduction, and we have noticed a decrease in the consumption of red meat, meat consumption across the piece has not yet decreased.
Thanks, Michelle. There is another question for you from Joanna. Do we have access to similar work done in other countries to see the difference in how they have fared?
I don't have access to what has been done in other countries. I think we've been as quick as, I'm going to say as quick as humanly possible, actually, in terms of publishing this stuff. It was a great deal of hard work and some very long days for my team to get it out there. So I'm sure we will be seeing this stuff published in due course. But apart from what is in the public domain and the conversations that we have with our international peers, we don't know how these things have differed across different countries, but it would be a very interesting project.
And another couple of questions for you again. Is there any evidence to suggest that families have difficulty making the time to cook when balancing working from home with homeschooling?
I think there's quite a lot of data that and a lot of qualitative evidence that would suggest that is the case. I think that when we're looking at that split in how people have responded, and food is the sort of the lens that we look through, we've seen that quite a few people, again in the qualitative research, told us that they were finding the respite from normal social lives and normal lives, giving them time to focus with their family. And we did see that 4 in 5 people were eating with their family. But on the other hand, for many people, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say for many women, it has added pressure to what is already a very busy day, to have to be responsible for all of the household stuff, or and as we've seen, more than twice as likely to be women, plus working, plus homeschooling. And that's not obviously to say that men are not also doing that, but where we saw that split was definitely around kind of whether people had more time or less time, and you could easily conjecture that would have an impact.
Yes. Another question from Joanna. Do we have data on how this pandemic has affected people with food-connected issues like food allergies? Have different waves of purchasing food impacted positively, negatively on their experience? Does their age matter? For example, young people with allergy as opposed to adults with allergies?
So there's a lot of questions there. I think that where we're limited in being able to give you data on people with allergies is that people with allergies, and I mean other hypersensitivities is more, but people with allergies declared as about 2% of the population. So we find often the signals are very, very difficult to pick up in a general public sample, and all of this research has looked at the public more generally. We are continually doing research with people with allergies, and but we have to be very close to them to get the sample sizes up to what we need. So we haven't yet been able to go into that sort of depth for this particular small but vulnerable group. But what we do know, sorry to take up the time, what we do know is that we have to focus on younger people with allergies, because that's where the majority of the risky behaviours seem to lie, and our campaign at the moment is focusing on people that age.
Thanks. There is another question for you, Michelle, from Anne Morcott. It'd be helpful to have clear reference to the source of data that you used. She can guess one or two, but I'm not sure she is right. Presumably the research plus details of a methodology are all published online. Yes, you can.
Yeah, yes, they are. And if you, I mean, I could give you the link, but if you just search FSA COVID research, it's all together on one page.
Yes, and to address several questions around publication of the slides, all the presentation will be made available online alongside the recording of the event on our website at a later stage.
Another roundup of this stuff is on our board paper that we recently published on horizon scanning and COVID, and quite a lot of that data is published in there too, if you want a condensed version.
There is also a couple of questions around the national food strategy, which I suggested we leave for the last session when we'll be talking about public engagement with Professor Peter Jackson and addressing the question then. Possibly we have a time for another question. In my local area, there has been a bit of a backlash from independent restaurants against the big three because of their big cards. Is there any research into restaurants going off those platforms, coming up with alternative solution? Lucy, is something that you have covered?
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Yes, there is definitely some backlash, and there's also some early research into what proportion of sales that currently come via platforms might have come in a disintermediated way, so in a way that would be direct to the vendor. And I'll try and find the link and post it on your question to that research. There are also some alternative solutions that are being launched at the moment. So there's a delivery logistics, I suppose, software solution that's being launched by the founder of Crosstown Donuts, which is a London donut brand, which I think is called Slurp. And then there are also some delivery only solutions. So an example of that is called Stuart. in the UK, which you might have seen some of the bikes with the boxes going around, where the restaurant can buy delivery-only services. One of the problems that vendors find is that by giving the delivery to another supplier, they lose a lot of the data on what's happening with those interactions with consumers, and they lose ownership of the customer experience. So from a business perspective, there's obviously a challenge there. Do we want to invest in building our own delivery supply chain, which is obviously expensive upfront, or do we and also maintain that control, or do we want to outsource that but risk that loss of connection directly with the consumer?
Thanks, Lucy. There was another question around inspection of dark kitchens, which I'm trying to find because probably is suitable for you. Can you see, Lucy, the question?
Yeah, I've got it. So the question was, how are food safety inspections regulated around dark kitchens? So the answer to this one is, so dark kitchens are culinary facilities that don't have a front of house function, i.e. they don't have consumers coming to the site. And as they prepare food, they are food businesses, and therefore would be expected to register with their local authority. They'd then be subject to inspections within the general set of interventions. And that's also true for, you've mentioned pop-up services, so they would normally count as a mobile caterer who appear at things like food markets, etc. And that's also true for them. There are, however, challenges in identifying unregistered sellers, as you can imagine, and I think there's actually a number of projects ongoing at the FSA as to what methods can be used to find them.
Thanks, Lucy. I think we now need to move to session 2. Thank you very much to all the presenters. Thanks, Michelle, Yusa, Lucy, and thanks to the audience for your questions so far. Apology, we haven't been able to cover them all. We now move to innovative data collection, online survey methods, and we will start with Dr. Patton Smith, Research Director at Ipsos Mori, a visiting professor at Surrey University. He will be presenting around using a web push methodology for FSA, our flagship survey, Food and You. Patton?
Hello, can you see or hear me?
Yes.
Both. Marvellous, good. I never quite trust these things. Okay, let me just move over to the slide deck then. Unless there's anything you want to say first, probably not. We've only got 10 minutes, so I shall move to the slide deck now. Right, is that showing up? Hello, can people see that?
Yeah.
Yes, I can see.
Good. Right. So I'm going to describe basically the new Food and You FSA survey. New in the sense its methodology has changed from face-to-face interviewing to a web push methodology. And I'm going to just say a little bit about the reasoning why that's been done, and then a brief description of where it's actually got to now. So Food and You is the one we're doing now, the survey we're doing now, is part of a long series, Food and You survey series, and it's the FSA's flagship consumer survey, measuring attitudes to food and shopping and that kind of thing, food safety behaviour specifically, and what people know about safety, etc., and a whole range of other food-related issues. I say flagship because it's a high quality survey. It's a random. It always has been a random probability survey. So it's taking the problems of survey error very seriously and trying to minimise them. And until 2018-19, it was a biennial face-to-face random probability survey covering the general population of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland separately, with an overall sample of about 3,000. A review commissioned by the FSA in 2018, or reporting in 2018, recommended moving the survey to a web push methodology with a larger sample. And just to fast forward a bit, Ipsos Mori won the new contract and implemented the first wave, and we've just finished the fieldwork for the first wave of the new Food and You web push series. Now, I just want to go back a little bit because I suspect not everyone is totally au fait with what I mean by web push. I think I just need to talk you through that a bit. Web push surveys have three main characteristics. First, they're high quality surveys. They use random probability sampling. Secondly, they are predominantly, hence the word web, online data collection methods. They're not exclusively online, as I'll describe later, and why that is the case. And why web push? Why the word push? Because they use online, they use offline contact and recruitment methods. So they start off with offline and then get people to do an online questionnaire. So why web push? This comes in two slides. The first is why web, and the second is then why pushing to web. Now, why web? There's a host of different factors, push and pull factors, which are driving clients all over, public sector, private sector, all clients all over the place to prefer or to move to web data collection methods in surveys. One basic start is that the standard high quality survey in UK, which has been, for most of my career, face-to-face, random probability face-to-face, the response rates have been declining inexorably for at least this millennium. Probably longer, actually. I think in the 90s they were too. And coupled with that is the costs are going up and budgets are flatlining. Costs are going up because it's becoming, even though the response rates are going down, it's becoming harder and harder to stop them going down even more, to resist the decline. So it's becoming an expensive operation. The alternative, an obvious alternative would be RDD, random digit dialing, telephone, high quality telephone service. They are also falling through the floor, response rates are falling through the floor, and the whole issues of mobile only households are causing all sorts of additional complications. So they don't seem to be viable in the UK anymore. Government digital transformation, there's generally a move within government, particularly in ONS, to move data collection online. So there's a push there. Online coverage is now high, roughly 95%. So of households. So if we want to do an online survey, we're going to cover a very large proportion of the population now, and the public are kind of expecting online contact. So much more shopping and tax forms, all sorts of things are done online than they used to be. It's cheaper, which relates to the earlier point about the rising cost of face-to-face. And importantly, there's a bit of a techie one. There's been methodological evidence, again, since the early 2000s, that low response rates are not necessarily as damaging to error and non-response bias as we had always feared, and that was basically the conventional wisdom through most of my life. But there's evidence that it's far less damaging than it was. Now, I say that, the reason I bring that up is that web push surveys definitely have lower response rates than the face-to-face ones they replace, but this may not matter as much as we think. So why do we have to push people to the web? Well, because we're talking here about random probability surveys, and a good random probability survey requires a high coverage sample frame. And in the UK, the only good sample frames for general population don't have email addresses attached. In fact, by far the most commonly used frame is to put the postcode address file, PAF, which is merely a list of addresses across the country. So what we have to do is make contact to that postal address on the PAF sample and persuade, hence the word push, respondents to respond online. So thus, as I say, thus was born the web push survey, defined as the use of offline contact modes to encourage people to go online and complete a web questionnaire. So that's the reasoning. Now, what about the new food and use survey? Well, just a little brag about Ipsos Mori. We have been at the forefront of UK web push methods, and in particular on the active live survey, which is very, very large. I think it's the largest web push survey in the country, and we're constantly exploring and innovating, and the new food and you is very much benefiting from that knowledge. So what do? PAF sample of addresses, postcode address file, as described before, separate samples in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Each address sends a letter with a URL and 2 logins to online questionnaire. I'll come back to the 2 logins in a moment. We ask any 2 adults aged 16 or over in the household to participate. We have 3 reminder mailings. The second reminder includes a paper version of the questionnaire, and we offer £10 to everyone who participates, every individual who participates. Here is the invite letter, just to give you make it a little more concrete than the abstractions I'm dealing with. So this is the first letter that arrives in people's mailboxes. I mean, literally letterboxes, old school letterboxes. In England, there's slight variations of logos and things depending which country you're in. So this is basically this letter, which just as I say, is just really to give you a flavour of what they get, and is asking people to do what I've said earlier. So, for example, if you look at the big green bit of it, which is there, deliberately set out to attract the eye for people who skim read. It shows you where to go, where the respondents should go website-wise, and then offers the passwords and mentions the incentive. So I won't linger over it. That's just to give you a flavour of it. So, just two methodological questions quickly, which you may be wanting to ask us. Why no random selection of individuals? Why any two? This is simply as a product of the household structure in the UK. In the UK, 85% of households contain one or two adults. So no selection is required in 85% of households. Now, we could then do a random selection of 15%, but if you actually just model it, you'll find that just taking any two, overall, obviously including the 1 and 2 household adult households, overall 94% of the selections are those that would have been selected using a random procedure in any case. So it's massively, it makes very little difference, essentially. And secondly, we know from other evidence that a considerable number, when you ask households to do random selections on their own, or last birthday, next birthday, very few, large minorities don't comply. So we estimate that if we'd actually done a random selection for the other households, our overall getting the right selection would have increased from our current 94 to 96%. That doesn't seem worth the likely reduction in response rate we'll get by asking people to do something extra and fiddly. This is the logic behind the any two method. Slides aren't. Something's frozen here. Can you still hear me? Yeah, got it. Why a paper questionnaire is the other methodological question I just wanted to address. That is mainly for two reasons. One, to deal with people who aren't online. About 5% of households still aren't online. And secondly, to deal with non-response. Not everyone is comfortable completing online questionnaires. In particular, we find older and poorer people are less likely to be included on online than offline surveys, and this is evidence that comes from US and UK and is generally found, and that hasn't changed as yet. And the remedy is to include an offline mode. I mean, one could use face-to-face as a follow-up, but that would be far too expensive. So we use a paper questionnaire after the initial efforts to push people to web, and we find that improves the sample profile. So where are we now? We've completed the first wave of the New Food and New, completing data processing. Over 9,000 responses, far more than we anticipated. Why? Because the response rate was far higher than we thought it would be. We were reckoning about 20%, and we've actually got 30%. Perhaps something to do with lockdown and COVID, because we seem to be finding a boost on web push and web surveys generally over that period. 63% of our questionnaires were completed online, so 37% by post. And that was the first wave. The second wave is about to be launched. And overall, we regard this as a thoroughgoing success. And these are the response figures, which I shall leave you with. As you can see, the response rates, if you look at the fourth column, are hanging around the sort of mid-upper 20s to 30s percentage, and we're getting a roughly between 1 1/3 and 1 1/2 adults participating in each household. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patel. We now move to our second presentation for this session. We have Amy Lando, social scientist at the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition at the US Food and Drug Administration. She will be presenting moving around food safety and nutrition survey, moving from phone to address-based sampling. Amy, are you on the line?
Yes, good morning. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to present. And I think this presentation will follow nicely to the one we just heard, because in the US, we are also transitioning to a web-based panel. So let me show my slides. I'm sorry, do you see my slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you again. So yes, I'm going to be presenting on FSANS, FDA's Food Safety and Nutrition Survey, and again, talking about moving from phone to address-based sampling. Before I get going, I just wanted to introduce the rest of the team I work with at US FDA. I'm here on the left, and across the screen you can see my colleagues Linda Barrell, Fan Wu, and Martine Ferguson, and they all are social scientists and statisticians who work with me on this project. Very briefly, just wanted to mention who we are. I work for the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, and this is part of the US Food and Drug Administration. And the US FDA is the scientific regulatory agency responsible for the safety of the US's domestically produced and imported foods, cosmetics, drugs, biologics, medical devices, and radiological products. The Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition is one of FDA's 6 product-oriented centers, and is a national leader in protecting and promoting public health by safeguarding more than $1.5 trillion worth of food, cosmetics, and dietary supplements. And across the bottom, you can see some captions of all the different types of work that we do here at CFSAN. And science and research is, of course, one part of it, and social science is where I work and is one part of the type of science that we do at CFSAN, and the survey fits nicely under the science and research portfolio. So very briefly, organizations decide to conduct surveys all the time for a variety of reasons and on a variety of topics. And here at CFSAN, we conduct surveys to find out what consumers know, believe, and do with respect to food safety and nutrition. Despite the diversity in topics, one thing that all surveys tend to have in common is that they include a structured questionnaire to ask questions of a sample of the total population. And the goal of a survey is to generate inferences about the target population from which the sample is drawn. And here at CFSAN, we conduct consumer surveys with the general public kind of for 3 main purposes. The first is to understand what consumers know, believe, and do, to help us evaluate and develop our educational consumer messages and materials, and also to help monitor trends in consumer behavior, knowledge, and attitudes over time. We have 2 repeated cross-sectional surveys at CFSAN that have gone back to the 1980s. The first is our food safety survey, and the second is our health and diet survey. And we've been conducting those every 3 to 5 years, again, going back to the 1980s. And they were both 15 to 20 minute random digit dial telephone surveys. So we used to do it over the phone rather than in person. And the food safety survey focused on safe food handling, perceptions of different food risks, as well as consumption patterns of potentially risky foods and raw sprouts. The health and diet survey was focused on consumers' knowledge and use of the nutrition facts label on food packages, as well as their understanding of diet-disease relationship. And until recently, phones were a really good way to reach people in the US, to talk with them, and you could randomly call them and get a really good sample of adults in the United States. And also, by having an interviewer ask all of the questions and providing the response options, the interviewer can make sure that the respondent understands the question and completes the survey in its entirety. However, in the last few years, and again, going back probably more than a few years now, at least about 20 years, it's become about harder and harder to get people to take surveys on the phone. And again, for a variety of reasons. Many people don't have landlines anymore. And again, while we can call people on cell phones as part of the survey frame, people don't always want to answer their phone, especially if they don't know who's calling, and everyone has caller ID now. Secondly, people just don't want to talk on the phone like they used to. People are much more comfortable with text or other online ways of communication, and they especially don't want to talk, spend a lot of time, like 15 minutes, talking to a stranger revealing personal information about themselves. And for that reason, we've transitioned now to this food safety and nutrition survey, the FSANS. And it was really done in 2 stages side by side. Our main survey is now an address-based survey with a web push. But we also, at the same time, did a small RDD comparison, and we fielded them both at the exact same time so we could look at the comparison between the 2 surveys and see what differences there may be due to the mode effects. And therefore, in 2017, again, was kind of when we decided we needed to change the way we collected data. We changed from an interview-assisted phone survey, the RDD, to the self-administered web and paper survey. And again, our goals were to increase response rate, increase our population coverage, and with an online survey, you can have a little bit longer, so you can increase the number of questions. And as I mentioned, we also conducted a small phone survey at the same time with both landline and cell phones to look at the mode effects between the 2. And ultimately, we also combined our food safety and nutrition topics into this one new food safety and nutrition survey. And again, this is an example of the first contact letter that we sent, and it looks very similar to the one we just saw, again, highlighting in the center how you go online to take the survey. And we encourage people to go online to take the survey, but follow up again with a paper and pencil version for people who don't feel comfortable or don't want to go online. A little bit more detail about how we transitioned to the single FSANS. It was a very long process, and we were very deliberate and systemic about how we went through that transition. Again, we had 2 surveys, the health and diet and the food safety survey. And so in order to get to this one combined survey, we met with food safety and nutrition experts. We reviewed existing food safety and nutrition surveys. We drafted new survey questions where needed for sort of hot topics here in the US, such as menu labeling or eating raw and uncooked flour. We had to update our question wording and skip patterns because, again, there's a lot of differences between administering a survey over the phone versus having someone read and fill in a survey for themselves using the ABS methodology. We had to develop all of our contact materials to encourage people to go online. And of course, we conducted cognitive interviews and pilot tests to make sure that people could go through the survey, understand all the questions, and fill it out quite easily. And this, again, just to give you a little bit of example of the 3 different looks to our FSANS questionnaire. On the far left, we have our ABS, the web version, so you could go online and take it online, and you could see that it's our FDA website, and it has our title, and it's pushed here to take the survey now. For people who didn't feel comfortable going online, we sent them in the 4th mailing a paper and pencil version of the survey that they could mail back to us. And you can see in the middle, the book, this is the front cover page of our booklet. And finally, on the right is the RDD interview capture screen. And this was, again, for our smaller phone survey. We had it programmed so that there were still traditional phone interviewers who conducted that survey. Here gives a map of the different topics that we included on our survey. And we really thought about food holistically. We thought about shopping for food, preparing food, of course, eating food, and storing food. And within these kind of holistic approach, we have multiple topics and questions about nutrition facts label in the US, the food package claims, so looking for things like healthy or natural or organic on the food package. Again, organic foods are a big topic, genetically engineered foods, looking at how people prepare food and what safe practices and food hygiene standards they employ in their homes, looking at raw food consumption and potentially risky foods, looking at recipes and cooking frequency. We have a number of questions about eating out at restaurants and whether people have seen different types of menu labeling, health inspection scores, again, general diet, disease, knowledge questions, food safety knowledge questions, a few questions on food allergies, and as I mentioned, a few questions on consumption of potentially risky foods, and of course, questions about how people store foods after consuming it. Very briefly, this is some of our details about the survey. It was fielded, it's hard to believe, about a year ago. So everything is before COVID. So we have the best pre-data that you could want. We have samples for our ABS. We had over 4,000 for the RDD. As I mentioned, it was a smaller sample, so we have about 800. Both surveys were with US adults aged 18 and older. Again, fielded last fall. For the ABS, we use the U.S. Postal Service mail file, so we have a sample of addresses where people live. It was a web push with up to 5 contacts, and on the 4th contact, we sent the paper and pencil version of the survey. We conducted both of our surveys in English or Spanish, whichever the people were more comfortable taking. For the ABS, we provided a $2 advance token of appreciation. And the response rates, as you can see, I think are in line maybe with some of what you're seeing in the UK, that we have about 28%, and this is the APOR response rate 3 for our ABS. And not surprising, our response rate for the phone survey was much smaller. And so just currently, we are in the data analysis and dissemination phase. We are continuing our analysis, and right now we're really looking carefully at the mode effects. We're looking at things like coverage bias, non-response bias, and measurement bias. And again, we're going to be having a lot more presentations and reports, both in peer-reviewed journals and on our websites in the future. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you. And here's my contact information if you have additional questions that we can't cover today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy, for your presentation. We now have a few questions for both our presenters. Shall we start with Professor Smith asking a question on is Ipsos web push methodology written up somewhere external? A question from Sophie Payne-Gifford.
It's written in. Sorry, can you hear me? I've got my. Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Well, it's not written up formally in a peer-reviewed journal. It is written up in a sort of how we do it, Ipsos glossy production, which does give some of the logic of what I just went through and has some of the references we've referred to, which I'm sure very similar literature to Amy. It's, a lot of it comes up the Dillman group, for example. So yes, there is. I can forward you the link. Not the second, but but I can certainly. I mean, if you arrange something, I'll send you the link. So.
Okay. Thanks. And regarding the first food and you, was there any bias in the profile of the respondent?
The current one, it's still too early to have ascertained it. We're only just getting the data processing right, but I can pretty well guarantee there will be, because all surveys have non-response bias and some non-coverage bias, and the critical thing is to find the way of minimising it, in particular through adjustment and weighting. So I mean that's not. I'm not. When I say yes, it will be. It's not a sort of shock horror. This is a survey that's going to be worse than other surveys. Just all surveys do. It's the reality of life, and that's part of our job is to try and minimise any bias that appears in the final tables.
And another question for you around the response rate. Someone asking about the 30%, which is still an optimal amount, combined with a question from Anne Morcott that actually think the response rate, the 30%, although seems shockingly low, is still not so low compared to the usual understanding in survey research. Would you like to comment on the response?
Well, in terms of response rate, I mean, I'm coming from a position having spent most of my career doing face-to-face, random probability face-to-face surveys, where response rates have been declining. And when I started, they were up in the sort of 70s and 80s. They're now down more to the sort of 50-ish kind of level. So this is definitely a drop down to and the kind of standard UK level of around, depends on the subject matter and whatever, and the sponsor, but is around 20%, and so getting 30 is pretty good. It's still low relative to to what I used to get, but then the point being that the critical question is to what extent it's damaging, because its response rate is not in itself a measurement of error. Non-response bias is the error. So if you get things where the estimates are not what they are deviating from the true population estimates, that's what we should be worrying about. So as I mentioned before, the recent literature seems to indicate in many cases the response rate is a very, very poor indicator of non-response bias. So we are more relaxed about having lower response rates and living with them than we used to be. Not complacent, though, but more relaxed.
Thanks. And a couple of questions for Amy. As well as getting info back from your survey, do you use the letter and/or the web to give info and the links on food safety to the people completing the survey?
I'm sorry, so you're asking if we provide the responses?
If you get back from your survey, if you use a letter or the web to give info and links on food safety to the people that are completing the surveys.
So I think I understand the question, and I'm sorry if I'm not quite answering this question correctly. I'm not completely sure, but as we do the survey, we are not providing education and information. We, of course, on our letters, when we send them to people to encourage them to participate, has the FDA link. And once you're there, you can find a lot of information, educational materials there. But the goal of the survey is not to educate, it's to find out what consumers know. So I hope that answers the question. If not, I apologize for being off on my answer.
Yes, thanks, Amy. And last question for you. Do you experience the same trend in the US that's like in the UK, with a slightly decrease in consumption of red meat?
Oh, I know I can't really speak to that today. Yeah, we don't have that on our survey. I believe there are other people in the US who do cover that. But yeah, no, I can't speak to that today. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Amy. I think we are now reaching the time for a break. I'd like you to thank Amy and Patton for their interesting presentation. I will ask the audience to join after a short break at 11:45 using the link number 2, please, that is being provided in your program and the instructions this morning. So let's have a short comfort break. We can have all a coffee in our place, and let's back at 11:45. Thank you.